Hi, I'm Andrew and I'm here today to introduce you to the QGIS 3 software package. So QGIS is an open source GIS package, which means it's completely free to use for both personal and commercial use. So with that, I'll dive straight in, and the first thing we need to do is obviously download the software. So to start, head over to this website, qgis.org, and you should land on the page you can see now. So simply hit the download now button, and you can see here that we've got various download options. So if you're a first-time user of QGIS, then I'd strongly recommend that you go with the standalone installer. So you can see here we have both 32 and 64-bit versions. So for most people these days, the 64-bit version is going to be the most appropriate. We also still have the previous long-term release available, and as you can see, there are download options for Mac, Linux, BSD, and Android as well. So I'm going to be using the 64-bit Windows version of the software today. So simply click on the standalone installer and your download should start. So I'm just going to cancel that because I have downloaded it already. So once your download finishes, click on the installer. And we're basically going to go through, agree with the license agreement, go with the default installation location. I'm not going to worry about installing the practice datasets, but if you want some data to play around with, you can add those to the installation as well, and then hit install. So while it does this, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of what I'll try to cover in this video. So obviously I'm beginning with downloading and installation. Hopefully I'll just talk you through the basics of the QGIS interface, adding datasets, arranging them within your workspace, some of the settings that we can apply, particularly changing the symbology and display of different layers, looking at the attributes table of some of our datasets. I'll also give you an overview of plugins, which are one of QGIS's most powerful features that allow us to add some additional functionality to the core QGIS program, a bit like kind of toolboxes or add-ons that you might get in other pieces of software. I'll also briefly give you an overview of creating new layers, quick look at the settings and menu options that we have, and then finish up with the map layout, actually producing some maps that we can then send to print. And last but not least, a quick overview of the 3D viewer, which is actually a new functionality to QGIS 3. So QGIS version 2 didn't have any functionality for natively handling the 3D display of layers, although there were a few plugins that could allow us to generate 3D visualizations. But actually in QGIS 3 we can now handle 3D natively, which is quite nice. Okay, so I think the installation is just about finishing up now. Tick-tock, there we go. Okay, so installation is finished, quick as that. And then we'll launch the program from our start menu down here, so QGIS 3. And here we go. So this is the screen that you'll see when QGIS first starts up. So just to highlight the main areas that we've got. So this is going to be our kind of main map canvas where we'll see any layers that we add in. Various menus and options at the top here. On the left we have our browser window, which is one of the ways that we can add layers into our map. And down the bottom corner here we've got our layers panel, where any layers we add in will appear. So we'll kick off by adding a layer into our map. So one of the simplest ways to do this is through the browser window. So we can see the various drives available. So in this case, I'm going to go to C drive, data, and I'm going to add in a layer showing some building outlines. These are actually from OS OpenMap Local, which is an open source dataset covering the UK, which is available free under the UK Open Government license. So using the browser, we can simply drag and drop the layers into our map. So it handles various types of layers, obviously the standard raster and vector data sets that we'd expect for any GIS. Down the bottom of our browser window, we can connect to other data sources, various database formats. An interesting one is XYZ tiles. So XYZ tiles allow us to connect to services, tile map services. So by default, this comes with OpenStreetMap as an option, which is great for giving us kind of, again, another open data set that allows us to have a kind of general base map wherever we're working in the world. The next way we have of adding data sets is using our data source manager, which is up the top left here. And in most cases, adding data sets from the browser is fine, but occasionally the data source manager provides us with some useful extra options. One particular example is if we're adding delimited text, so CSV files and similar. I'd strongly recommend adding those using the data source manager, as it has some issues with identifying correct data types for your columns if you add those directly using the browser. So I'm actually just going to use this to demonstrate adding a raster layer. So I'm going to go back to my data folder and this time add a DSM, a digital surface model, to my map. And we can see that appears in the center of the map here. And then the final way that we have to add data sets is actually to simply drag and drop them from another file explorer window. So I've added a buildings layer, so I'm actually going to drag and drop a roads layer to the map as well. So simple as that. So we've got three ways there of adding data sets into our map: from the browser, using the data source manager, or simply dragging and dropping from our file explorer. So now we've got our layers here. They're not in the most useful order. Our buildings are hidden at the bottom. So again, we can rearrange these by simply dragging and moving them within our layers window. So our layers here will appear in the order that they're shown. So whatever is on top in your layers window will appear on top in the map. So if I drag that back down, we can see it disappears under the other layers. If I drag it back to the top, then we can see the buildings layer again. Okay, so I think that's everything we need to know about adding data sets for now. So now we've got some data in, what can we do with it? So if we want to play about, change the display of our layers, we simply right click on them in our layers window here. And the first thing we might want to do is go to properties. So the properties window allows us to do all kinds of things. So it provides basic information about our layer, what it's called, where it is, the format, the projection that the data is in, its extents, source data. Here we can change the CRS coordinate reference system if we want to. One of the key ones that we'll probably want to play around with is symbology. So here at the moment we're set to have a single symbol for all of our buildings. We can change that simply by clicking on one of the presets here and clicking apply. You can see that changes in the map view here. We can select colors by clicking on the color wheel here, choosing a new color. Again, we can apply and see that. So in this case, we've only changed the fill color, not the outline. If we want to change the outline, we actually have to click on the simple fill option here. And then we can see that we now have the fill color and the stroke color. So maybe we'll change it to transparent stroke, get rid of our outline altogether. Click apply, and now we have nice green buildings. In here we can also set labels if we wish to use one of our attribute columns to add labels to the features. I'm not going to do that for now. Various sort of more advanced functions that we can carry out which go a bit beyond the scope of this video, but keep your eye out in the future because I may well cover those in a bit more depth. can see the fields and the formats that they're in. Can create an attributes form, join to other layers, all kinds of other things within the properties menu. So this is our kind of main point to go to when we want to kind of do anything to individual layers. So now I've played around with the symbology, I might leave it there. So actually one other useful thing is transparency. So actually for vector layers, like our buildings layer here, the transparency is tucked away a little bit. We have to expand this layer rendering option at the bottom here. And we can see we now have the opacity slider. So if we want to add some transparency, we can reduce that opacity slightly. And this time I'll click OK. And if I zoom in on the map, so just using the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, we can now see we have slight transparency to the layer here. So before we go any further, I should probably talk you through the tools for navigating around your map. So by default, we've started off with the pan tool up here. So with this, we can do a left click and drag to pan our map around. As I said, we can use the scroll wheel for zooming in and out, but we also have zoom options here. So we can simply click, or we can left click and drag to draw a bounding box around the area that we want to zoom into. And then we also have a zoom out option as well. This one here zooms to the full extent of all of our layers, which is slightly distorted at the moment because I have the OpenStreetMap layer, which has a less clearly defined extent than my other layers. So if we zoom back in here, there we go, back to our layers. Now one thing that can happen sometimes, it's quite easy to do within GIS, is that we sometimes zoom completely off and lose all of our layers completely. Easy to do. So if we ever do that, the easiest way to actually get back to our map is to right click on one of these layers in our layers window and click zoom to layer, and that will immediately just take us back to the full extent of that layer and allow us to find our map. One final thing to note before I go further when we're adding layers is we can also favorite particular folders to make it easier to find them in the browser window. So I was adding layers in from my data folder here. So if I want to, I can right click on that, add as favorite, and that will appear in my favorites list at the top here. So now rather than have to go through any kind of file tree to find that folder, I can simply expand it straight from my favorites just to save a bit of time and effort. Okay, so I've looked at the layer properties for a vector layer. I'm just going to look at them quickly for my elevation layer here because it looks slightly different. You can see we don't have quite so many options with raster layers as we do with vector layers, and in this case transparency appears in a separate tab. So if I wanted to add some transparency to that, I can just drag down in there and click apply. We can compute histograms, so look at the distribution of brightness, and in this case it's only a single band image, but if we had a color image with red, green and blue bands, we'd obviously be able to look at the histograms for different bands. We can make it so that the layers are only visible between a certain scale range. We can calculate pyramids to speed up display of large data sets. We can add metadata, all those kind of things. So I'm just going to come back to the symbology. So we have various options here. We have a multi-band option, which isn't very helpful with a single band layer. We can do single band pseudo color rather than just black and white if we want to add a color ramp to the data. But one of the options that I actually quite like with elevation data in QGIS is you actually have hillshade as a symbology option. So in some GIS packages we'd need to calculate hillshades using a separate tool, but actually within QGIS we can simply apply that on the fly and get a nice pseudo 3D effect from our elevation layer. And then I think the next thing to cover, so we've looked at our options, but obviously if we have vector datasets, then we also want to be able to look at the attributes that they have associated with them. So again, we simply right click on our layer and click to open the attribute table. And here we can see got an ID field, a feature code which relates to the Ordnance Survey's features. And I've also calculated some height values using some of the LiDAR data that I've got in the map. So that's something that I did separately, but just add some additional attributes to the layer, which we could use to visualize it if we so wished. I should also note that the LiDAR data that I'm using is actually another free open data set. In this case, it's from the UK or English Environment Agency. So if you're interested in elevation data, again, that's something that I'm planning to cover in another video in the not too distant future. So now we know how to add layers into our map, and we know how to change the symbology of those layers. So we kind of want to start looking at some of the other functionality that QGIS has. And I mentioned earlier on when we were waiting for the software to install the term plugins. So plugins, which we can get to by going to plugins, manage and install plugins, are essentially extensions to the core QGIS package. And these cover all kinds of things. So we can see here that by default, a number of plugins are already installed when we first install QGIS. I think includes the processing, which is quite a powerful plugin containing a wide range of tools for spatial analysis, but also a few other useful bits and pieces. And there's also some other plugins here that I've already installed previously. So if we click on the All tab here, then this lists all of the plugins that are available, and you can see there's dozens. If you're someone that's upgrading from QGIS 2.18 and watching this video to get a feel for how QGIS 3 is different, it is worth noting that not all of the plugins that are available in 2.18 are currently available in version 3. So there's new plugins becoming available almost every day, some of which are completely new and some of which are plugins that were available in version 2 that haven't yet been ported over to version 3. But it is worth just double checking that all the plugins that you want are currently available in version 3. If we want to install a plugin, so I'm going to install one that's very useful, QGIS hats, which just adds nice hats onto our QGIS logos. So we simply select the plugin that we want to use, click install plugin. And most plugins only take a few seconds to install. I'm going to have to, in this case, it says restart to check it out, although we can see I already have a nice little Christmas hat up here on my QGIS logo. If we go to our installed plugins, we can then turn things on and off. So I'd install QGIS hats. If I want to turn it off, it's as simple as unticking the box there. And some plugins are quite small, others, like this one here, the semi-automatic classification plugin, which is a really useful toolbox if you're interested in working with any kind of remotely sensed imagery, satellite data, those kind of things. If I turn that on, take a few seconds, you'll see this is actually quite a substantial plugin that adds a whole new set of menus to my QGIS window, a new dock down here, toolbar up here. So if I turn that back off again, they'll disappear. So QGIS plugins cover, like I said, a huge variety of things. And again, I may well go over some of those in future videos, but for now, it's worth just having a browse and seeing what there is that helps you with the kind of work that you're doing. Okay, so we've added layers, we've looked at the attributes, we've looked at plugins. Another thing that's quite useful to be able to do is to actually create our own new layers. So if we want to create new layers within QGIS, then one of the easiest ways to do it is with some of these buttons up here. So I'm just going to quickly create a new shapefile layer, which will allow us to then create our own features in the map. So I'm actually going to create a polygon shapefile. I'm going to set it to EPSG 27700 British National Grid, because that's what most of the rest of my data is in at the moment. And I am going to save this into my data folder, and I'm going to call it test. Okay, so simple polygon shapefile. If we wish to add some attributes fields, then we can simply add those in here. So I'm going to call this data, and we can choose whether we want text, whole number, decimal number. So I'm going to keep this as a set text field with a length of 80, and add that to my fields list. Then do OK, and I now have a new empty shapefile which has appeared in my layers window. And if we were to right click and open the attributes table, you can see it has an ID field and the data field that I requested. So we've got the layer. If we want to now create some features in that new layer, we can click on the toggle editing button up here. We can also do that by right clicking and clicking on toggle editing here. And once we do that, we see some other icons become available on our toolbar at the top. So the one that we want to use first is add polygon feature. This is essentially going to allow us to digitize some features. And I'm actually going to digitize very quickly and roughly around the edge. So I'm just left clicking here to digitize around the edge of this forested area. And then when you finish digitizing, right click to finish that shape. So ID is going to be 1, data is going to be forest. And there we go. We've now created a new polygon. If I open the attributes table, we can see that that's now got an ID of 1 and a label of forest. We can change these at the moment because I've still got editing enabled up here. So editing also needs to be enabled if we want to make any changes to our attribute data. So I'm going to close that attribute table down for now. And if we're working digitizing a lot of features, it's worth making sure we regularly click to save our edits up here. That way, if anything does go wrong, QGIS crashes, then you know that the data you've been working on is saved and you're not going to lose any of that. And then once we've finished digitizing, I'm just going to quickly do one more feature in here. Okay, ID 2, data, also forest. Then we can simply click on the toggle editing button again, and it will give us a final, do we want to save our changes, which we do because I just created a new feature. So I'll click save there, and we're now out of editing mode. If I go into the attributes table now, you'll see we can't change any of these values now that we've stopped editing. So that's covered a lot of the core features that we're likely to want to do when we first start using a new GIS system, adding layers, being able to edit features, change the symbology. It's worth noting we do have various other options up here within settings, which we can tweak, but to be honest, most of the time you're not going to need to worry about these. It's only once we move on to maybe some more advanced analysis that we might need to alter some of those settings. One other thing that I mentioned earlier was the processing toolbox and the tools that it allows us access to. That's another one of the options we have up here. If we go into processing, we can see it has the toolbox option here, and this gives us access to a huge array of different tools, both core QGIS tools, GDAL, the Geospatial Data Abstraction Library tools, some grass tools from GrassGIS, all kinds of things, and also tools from SagaGIS. So we have a huge array of data manipulation and data analysis tools available to us here. We also have some core raster and vector tools available to us through the menus at the top here. A georeferencer, analysis tools, calculating things like aspect, filling no data gaps, calculating hillshades if we want to produce them as a separate layer rather than on the fly like I've done here. Slope, topographic position index, all kinds of things. Assigning and changing projections for our data sets. Building virtual rasters, merging a number of tiles together, something we may well want to do if we're working with tiled data. Clipping our rasters, producing contours from elevation data, and converting from one format to another, including back and forth between raster and vector data. And similarly, we have a whole range of tools under our vector data set. So for working with GPS tools, joining by location, checking topology, our various tools for overlay analysis, buffering, clipping, difference, dissolve, intersection, calculating various attributes related to geometry, undertaking some kind of statistical analysis, identifying intersections, distance matrices. So I've not got time to go through all of these, otherwise this video would go on for hours and hours. Reprojecting vector layers, producing grids and random points, which can be quite useful for some research projects. So a whole range of tools that we have available to us. And again, keep an eye out because I may well cover some of those in more detail in later videos. But for now, I think it's enough just to know that they're there, and just encourage you to explore really, get some data sets and just have a play around. The best way to learn any kind of software tool really is to get stuck in yourself. So I'd recommend doing that if you want to get to know a bit more about some of these tools. So the final thing that I want to cover in this video is how can we actually produce some outputs from our data. So we've got various layers here. So how do we produce a nice map? So I'm just going to play around a little bit more with symbology before I do that, just to make things look a bit nicer. So again, I right-clicked and went to Properties to get to this option. And for our roads, I'm actually going to change them to a categorized symbol. And we now have the option to look at different columns and choose which one we want to categorize it by. So in this case, I'm going to categorize it by our road classification and then click Classify at the bottom here. So we can see it's now identified the different options we have within the attributes. A roads, access roads, local roads. And we can now set different symbols for some of these. So A roads, I'm going to use the default for main road here. Local access roads, I'm going to go with a red line. Actually, I'm going to set most of the smaller roads to the same red line. Primary roads, let's make it slightly thicker. So we have a width attribute up here. So I can change that. Let's double it, make that 1.2 rather than 0.66666. And restricted local access roads. So if it's restricted, maybe let's make that a dashed line to indicate that we don't have complete access. There shouldn't really be anything with no attributes, so I'm just going to untick that option there. And then if I click OK, we can now see that it's altered the symbology for those roads. We can see the different road types. I'm also going to set a symbology for my buildings layer as well. So again, right click into Properties. And this time I'm going to go to Categorized because I'm going to be setting using a numeric value rather than discrete classes. And I'm actually going to use the maximum height, maximum building height. And again, I can classify that. It has got a lot of classes. Oh, and that's what's happened. I've gone into categorized rather than graduated. Okay, so graduated for numeric values, maximum height, classify. Okay, and we now have a color ramp. So I'm going to change this to something different as we used reds for our roads. So let's go with blues. So lighter colors are going to indicate lower buildings, darker blues are going to indicate higher buildings. There we go. And we now have some coloring for our buildings. And finally, I'm just going to double click to open the layer properties. That also works if you double click on the symbol here. And I'm going to change our woodland areas to green, because that seems logical for a woodland area. Okay, there we go. So by no means the greatest example of cartography ever devised, but cartography again is not really my focus for today. So how do we produce a map from our layers? So for this we go to Project and go to New Print Layout. So we can name our print layouts, so we can have a number of print layouts linked to a map. I'm also going to creatively call this Test. And we get the print layout window. So this allows us to add various items to our map layout. So the first thing that I want to do is to actually add a map. So I can do that by clicking down here and then dragging the area that I want the map to cover. And we can see it displays exactly what is shown within our main QGIS window at the moment. So we can change settings from within here, or if we want to zoom in a bit more, we can kind of zoom in within the window here. Go back to our map window and, sorry, wrong button, set to map canvas extent, and that will then match what we've got in our current window. If we want to add other items, we can click Add Item up here, and we can add a legend. Draw that down here. Ooh, and that's not easily fitting at the moment, so we'll need to do some rearranging of our layout to fit the legend in nicely. Maybe we'll reduce the size of our map over there. I mean, we can obviously alter all of these settings, the font size, the size of the symbols. We can change those in the options over here. Subgroup font and item font. Okay, and we can see there we've now cut down on the size of our legend, and we can expand that back over there. So obviously you'd want to spend a lot more time tidying up the layout, making sure things look nice and neat. And I'm now going to add in a scale bar to the bottom of the map as well. So click and drag to add that. It's automatically defaulted to the map units that were being used, or the most sensible variation thereof. So my map is in meters, it's defaulted to kilometers, and we can choose the number of intervals that we want on the scale bar. So in this case I'm going to increase it to 5 kilometers. Send this to the back so that the white space is hidden behind my main map. So I did that using the option here. This allows us to raise, lower, bring to front, center back, so all the typical kind of arrangements. We also have options to align things centrally, both vertically and horizontally. So we could add various other features. We can add a text box if we want to add labels or titles into our map layout. So we can call this practice map. And again, we can change the font size, so make this a bit bigger. Font size 24. And I'm actually going to leave this at the bottom of the map for now. So again, that's all of our kind of basic functions in terms of creating a map layout. There's much more that we can do, but that's most of the essentials that we'll need for most maps. And finally, if we want to export our map, we can simply click on one of the options at the top here. So export it as a PDF, an SVG, or an image file. So let's export this as a PDF. And that's just given me a warning because I've got the OpenStreetMap web map layer in there. If I go to data, call this test, save it there, and we can now open that up, and there we go. There's our exported map. So that's what we do in terms of producing 2D maps. So the final thing that we can do, as I mentioned earlier, is actually to produce 3D map layouts. So we can do this by clicking View and then New 3D Map View. Now this is taking a little bit of time as it's downloading the OpenStreetMap data. So I'm actually just going to turn OpenStreetMap off for now to speed things up slightly. And we can see our map. Now, at the moment it's in 2D, but I'll need to give it some information about which layer to use in order to get 3D information. So if I click on the Configure button here, we can now choose an elevation layer. And this is going to be our DSM merge, our LiDAR data layer. Vertical scale, I'm actually going to exaggerate to 1.5 because things often don't look quite as elevated in 3D maps as they do in real life. And I'm going to leave it at the default resolutions at the moment, which is quite low, but obviously it takes a bit longer as we increase the resolution of the map. So I'm just going to click OK for now, and then middle click and rotate to turn our map around. And we can see that this has now got some elevation to it. So quite subtle. I've not picked the hilliest area. This is actually part of Shropshire. Maybe let's try increasing our vertical scale a bit more. Let's go up to 5 times vertical exaggeration. And here we go. We can now see, as I said, it's low resolution, so it's not mapping the elevations particularly well. They're just appearing as large lumps and bumps in the landscape. But you can see in the background the general shape of the terrain. And if we just, maybe let's try increasing this a little bit, put that up to 256. Let's put this up to 1024. Okay, and we can see that that's now still not perfect. In fact, the high vertical exaggeration is now a bit less appropriate. I'll reduce that slightly. We can start to see that our lumps and bumps are now matching up with the buildings and trees that we can see on the map. In fact, we could scroll over to our forested area and see how it's raised up, how the shape of the trees are being picked up in the LiDAR tiles here. So I'm going to close that back down for now. And obviously the final thing that we want to do is to make sure that we've saved our project so that we can access it later. Really, this is something that I probably should have done earlier. Always save regularly just in case something goes wrong. But to do that, we click on Project, Save As, and then it's our standard mechanism for browsing and saving files. So again, I'm going to go to the data folder here, save this map as test, and this saves as a QGZ file. So that's a QGIS project file essentially. So that project file doesn't contain the individual layers that you're using. It simply tells QGIS how to identify those layers, which ones it should be loading, how it should be symbolizing them. So you do need to be careful about making sure you don't go and move layers around that you've got as part of your maps. Otherwise, next time you open up this project, there'll be a pop-up box in the middle saying that some layers are missing, and you'll have to browse through and retell QGIS where those layers are located. So best to avoid that, but with a bit of good file management, if we keep everything within one folder and make sure we don't start moving things around that we know are in projects, then we shouldn't come up against any problems. Okay, so that's my introduction to QGIS 3. So hopefully that's been useful. It's been a very kind of quick and dirty overview of what can be done. And as I said, keep your eyes peeled because I am planning to put some more detailed videos up in the not too distant future, focusing on more specific aspects of what we can do with GIS and with QGIS more specifically, and also looking at some of the data sets that we have available. So thank you very much for your attention.